Hey, what's up, class? I'm gonna pick up here where Mrs. Kimbrell left off, and you clicked on this video because you wanted a couple more examples. So I want to try to be really specific and show you some good ones. Okay? Um, you so your goal here is to look for patterns in character motivation. That means one of two things can be true. One, a bunch of the same character can have a pattern in their own motivation. So like Proctor between Act 1 and Act 2, if he has like a similar motivation and it doesn't change, then that's a pattern. On the flip side, let's say that Elizabeth or let's say that Proctor has like the same motivation as Abigail, right? Notice that that's two different characters with the same motivation. Like that's a pattern. And thematically, that might show that like different types of people have similar motivations. And that says something about humanity. All right, so I'm going to start. We're going to read from like Elizabeth and Proctor's fight, part 2. This is right after Mary Warren leaves. Oh, the noose. The noose is up. There will be no noose. She wants me dead. I knew all week it would come to this. They dismissed it. You heard her say, and what of tomorrow? She will cry me out until they take me. Sit you down. She wants me dead, John, and you know it. I say, sit down. She sits, trembling. He speaks quietly, trying to keep his wits. Now we must be wise, Elizabeth. Now, keep in mind here, they're talking about like how Abigail brought up Elizabeth's name as somebody who might be a witch in the trials, and like you know what happens, right? If you listen to the previous thing, you know exactly what happens when people's names come up in those trials. Oh, indeed, indeed. Fear nothing. I'll find Ezekiel Cheever. I'll tell him she said it were all sport. Now remember, Abigail said that to John Proctor when they were alone in Act 1, and that's why Elizabeth was pissed earlier. John, with so many in the jail, more than Cheever's help is needed now. I think, would you favor me with this? Go to Abigail. What have I to say to Abigail? John, grant me this. You have a faulty understanding of young girls. There's a promise made in any bed. Whoa, bed. Hang on. Let's jump back for a second. Here we have like a break in a pattern of character motivation, right? Elizabeth, her motivation is to stay alive, stay married to John, which is contrary to Abigail's motivation to kill Elizabeth in order to get with John. But now Elizabeth is asking, like, hey, would you go to Abigail? This is a 180 degrees change in what she's asking. But she's asking that because, like, she needs John to take. Let's keep reading. But, like, as a reader, I'm going, like, oh, that's the exact opposite of what you said before. That kind of inconsistency kind of tells me something. You have a faulty understanding of young girls. There's a promise made in any bed. What promise? Spoke or silent, a promise is surely made, and she may dote on it now. I am sure she does, and thinks to kill me, then to take my place. It is her dearest hope, John, I know it. There be 1,000 names. Why does she call mine? There be a certain danger in calling such a name. I'm no goody-good that sleeps in ditches, nor Osborne, drunk and half-witted. She dare not call out a farmer's wife, but there be monstrous profit in it. She thinks to take my place, John. Now, I just want to say here, I didn't make a note here, but I can. Notice here the repetition of names um, from Act 1 to now. And what's interesting about that is like, you know what? You leave a note there. You figure it out. But that repetition, that pattern, and like she's talking about names, and her motivation is not to have her name called, right? If that's maybe that's similar to somebody else, because most of Act 1 was about naming names. She cannot think it, but notice here, he knows that it's true. John, have you ever shown her somewhat of contempt? She cannot pass you in the church, but you will blush. I may blush for my sin. I think she sees another meaning in that blush. And what see you? What see you, Elizabeth? I think you be somewhat ashamed, for I am there, and she's so close. So I'm just gonna like stop there for a second. I'm noticing like the word blush kind of reminds me a bit of Act 1, right? Because Abigail in Act 1 says very explicitly, there be no blush about my name. But when she was saying it, she was denying the fact that she had like slept with someone outside of marriage. That she's basically saying like, Uncle, I'm not a thought. Like, Uncle, I don't sleep around. and she's right, she doesn't, but she did sleep with Proctor. So here, like when she was talking about it, blush is redness, lust, corruption, blood, life, and that's the kind of blush that Elizabeth is talking about, right? And when John says, "I may blush for my sin," right? He's talking about like embarrassment. And here's the pattern, right? Because like I'm noticing the pattern of when they were talking in Act One, like John was flirting with Abigail, right? Like he was into it, even though he was like into it right up until the line where he knew that if he crossed that line, he would be committing that sin again, right? He's embarrassed by that desire, I think, because like he wants to be a good person. And he said that earlier where he says, "I mean to please you, Elizabeth." So like, yeah. So it's one of those things where like sorry, I just got a text message and got distracted. I know how you guys feel in class. But his sin, right? Yes, he committed adultery. And that's connected to pride because like pride is about doing stuff that you're not supposed to, right? And thinking you're better than those rules. And adultery is just that exact same act in, a very specific place. But like he's still seen as a good, productive farmer. Just like Elizabeth said earlier, when there be shame or there be a monstrous risk, or excuse me, let me just get the actual line. Um, there we go. She dare not call out such a farmer's wife, but there be monstrous profit in it, right? And monstrous being that like less than human profit. So like just know there, I'm connecting that to like John's motivation. He wants to be a good person, but like he has these conflicting desires where he also wants the things that are contrary to what he believes. And that's something we can all identify with. Like, right, as humans, sometimes we do things against our values and then have to deal with the shame of that. Speaking of shame, I think she sees another meaning in that blush. And what see you? What see you, Elizabeth? I think you be somewhat ashamed, for I am there and she so close. When will you know me, woman? Were I stone, I would have cracked for shame this 7 months. Then go and tell her she's a whore. Whatever promise she may sense, break it, John. Break it. Good then. I'll go. He starts for his rifle. Now that's interesting because you got to ask yourself, like, yeah, Abigail's dangerous, but you don't need to bring a gun. You know what I'm saying? Um, so like, why is he picking up his rifle? So that's just something I'm noticing there. Um, and now Elizabeth trembling fearfully. Oh, how unwillingly, right? I will curse her hotter than the oldest cinder in hell, but pray, begrudge me not my anger. Your anger, I only ask you, woman, am I so base? Do you truly think me base? I never called you base. And by the way, base is an insult, meaning low, rude, coarse, undesirable, animalistic. It's think of it like low class, right? Um, so do you think me so like an animal? Then how do you charge me with such a promise? The promise that a stallion gives a mare I gave to that girl. And here's another thing I'm noticing, right? Like I just said, base connected to animalistic. Um, that word above monstrous. So I'm noticing this pattern in like language having to do with animals, right? The promise that a stallion gives a mare I gave that girl. So notice how he compares not only Abigail, who Elizabeth has asked him to call a whore, which is like a name used to make somebody subhuman, reduce them to a single act instead of the complexity of their humanity. But notice here how he compares himself and the act of his sin to animals or something else subhuman. And then let's combine that with what we know about Proctor. Then why do you anger with me when I bid you break it? Because it speaks deceit and I am honest, but I'll plead no more. I see now your spirit twist around the single error of my life, and I will never tear it free. He'll tear it free when you come to know that I will be your only wife, or no wife at all. She has an arrow in you yet, John Proctor, and you know it well. Now, here's what I'm going to ask you. Like, this idea that John Proctor is honest, that's from, his unwillingness to, like, he did commit adultery, and that is an act of dishonesty, but then he confessed it to his wife, right? Like, he cheated on his significant other, and then right away, like, confessed it, then they fired Abigail, even though he's still kind of into it, right? So he's, like, taking the action, but he hasn't made the honest admission, right? He's talked about, I am honest, and yet above he can't seem to like be honest with his wife. The very first thing he does in this chapter is lie to her by like seasoning the soup and then lying and telling her that she did a great job, right? So notice he is still acting against his values, and that still causes a sense of shame. And that shame is a motivating factor, right? Like maybe the pattern of John Proctor says that sometimes we are motivated to do good only by our shame. Now, and I want you to hear this with an open mind and know that I'm not being gross, okay? A lot of the imagery in this chapter is sexual. And I want to kind of walk you through the sort of pattern in that and how it connects to a character's motivations, right? And I'm going to draw upon some like old kind of stereotypes of masculinity from the time that the book was written. So Proctor wants to be honest, but he isn't. We just went over that, right? He still loves his wife, but he's still attracted to Abigail, and he feels and it says earlier, a softness for her. And pun intended, and you'll see why in a second, because he's unable to take action on what he wants, but he's also, because he isn't taking action on that front, he can't take action in his marriage to make a decision, right? Think about it, right? When he's angry and when he's going to do something decisive, he picks up his rifle. But the first thing he does when he walks in at the very beginning of the chapter, all the way up there, is he puts down the rifle. Now ask yourself, like, and this is not a controversial statement, this is a pretty well established fact, guns are what's called phallic imagery. And you can Google the definition of phallus. Maybe we'll do that in class. But like that's associated with, yeah, he's holding the gun as he's saying all this, associating another phallic symbol with his impotent rage. He is angry because he hasn't taken action, because he hasn't done anything. And again, the word impotent there is not an accident. He hasn't fully accepted the consequences of his actions. Now, remember the video of Abigail and Proctor from Friday's lesson, okay? Abigail grabs John in a very vulnerable place. And you have to ask yourself, in that moment, who is in control? And this is about Proctor's emasculation. Okay, he is unable to be honest in anything but words to either person, because taking action means making a decision and accepting the consequences of that decision, because he's unwilling to, quote, man up and face society. So this is a figurative castration, a figurative loss of decisive power, of autonomy, right, of strength. He doesn't have control over his own phallus, hence Abigail, like, where he has to put the gun. He doesn't have control over, like, not he doesn't have control, but it's winter in his house and spring outside, right? Outside, he is able to like bring life. He is able to be fertile. He is able to plant seeds. Inside, it is winter in here yet. There's no seed planting going on, if you catch my drift. But he doesn't have control over that life, that masculinity since before. And the phallus has been a symbol of masculinity since before the very first sophomore defaced somebody else's notebook. Another interesting point, Arthur Miller wrote this to criticize the people in America who were like red baiting and searching for communists and like being super into like finding the communist scourge and othering the Russians and like kill the Soviets, winning the Cold War. That led to McCarthyism, right? Which you guys will study in history in a bit. But basically, people would point at someone and say, you're a communist. And then if they said, no, I'm not, they would say, of course, that's what a communist would say. And the only way to like not be blacklisted and like to die a public death, even if you're not killed, is to point and say, and basically repent and say, yeah, but I know communists, it's these like people. Sounds like witch trials, right? Now, if you think about Proctor, who's unwilling to like call out the heart of this lie publicly because he doesn't want to face the social repercussions, what do you think Arthur Miller is saying about his friends who refused to stand up to McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee? What do you think he's saying about their masculinity or their decisiveness, if you will? Maybe he's calling his contemporaries impotent, which, when you think about it, it's not a super nice thing to say. But anyway, notice there how I pulled out some similarities in character motivation, right? Some like, I used evidence from Act 1 and then connected what Proctor did in Act 1 with Abigail to Proctor's actions here and look for the pattern between those two, which was the idea that in Act 1, he was ashamed of what he wanted, even though he was walking towards it, the kind of allure and something forbidden. And then in Act 2, right, that shame that leads him to be super emasculated because he can't take action because it makes that shame come to light in public. And that would hurt. So I pointed out through those similarities in character motivation between the chapters that Proctor is motivated primarily here by shame, not by the desire to be the kind of good that he is. Even though he says he is honest, he is not, and that inability to live up to his values is hurting him. So like, just see that. That's the kind of thing I'd like you to start seeing in your reading, right? But that requires that you remember what you read, which means sometimes before you read, reviewing your annotations. This isn't the first time I've read the book. What we're asking you to do is difficult, right? But it's important to practice, because if you can see patterns like that, then people in your life will be able to lie to you less frequently, and you'll notice patterns in people's behavior that helps you understand them better. Okay. The second thing I want you to know is I did that by looking at the imagery in the words, right? That pattern of comparing things to animals, the pattern of the phallic imagery. Phallic, by the way, means things shaped like a penis. Now, go back, rewind, listen to those jokes again, and you'll find me hilarious, right? The specific word blush and how it was used. Like, that's what it means to read and think at a 10th grade level, is to be able to notice those details and like see a pattern in them, and then connect that pattern and ask, why is that? Like, what is that saying? Why is it there? How is it working? And come to a deeper understanding of humanity, that even the most honest of us can be motivated by shame when we fail to live up to our own values and fear the social consequences of doing so. So as you continue on in reading Act 1, remember, I want you to read up to this bit with Hale. Here's more with Hale. You need to know the word adultery there. This bit with Francis Nurse and Giles comes in. Here. This is where I want you to read. Enter Ezekiel Cheever, a shocked silence. I'm going to add the question, did you know you should stop here today? I'm going to make it a poll, and yes, or the other answer, no, but I will. All right. So as you read, you should notice 2 to 3 similarities in those character motivations. We're going to go over some of these accusations in a little bit more detail in class, but you have to read to get to there. Otherwise, you're going to be frustrated and confused, and neither Miss Kimbrell nor I nor Mr. Brown want that for you. Thanks, guys. Good luck.